There are actually two types of exceptions in Java. So far, all the exceptions that we demonstrated in our program, we knew that we didn't really have to write try and catch statements. All we had to do is just to write some code. If the runtime exception, when the program is running, had to occur, the program could crash because the exception was generated at runtime. Realizing that this may happen, we started adding these try and catch blocks like this one and this one to handle a number format exception, or this one and this one to handle input mismatch exception. So this was optional. We could write code without try and catch, or we could just write the code just as we did here and with anticipation of this exception to happen. So we had an option here. So these are called unchecked exception, and unchecked exceptions, generally speaking, the definition of an unchecked exception in Java is that the compiler during the compile time really doesn't care about these exceptions. It just says, okay, it's your choice whether you'd like to catch these exceptions by applying try and catch structure, or you can just totally ignore them and hope that everything will be okay at runtime, because your user will always be entering perfect values from their keyboard. So we really had this option, and compiler did not interfere. So these examples are examples of unchecked exceptions. Right, so let me just write it up. Unchecked exceptions. Right, so unchecked exceptions are exceptions of type Java language runtime exception. Let me give you a little bit of a demonstration of this. So for instance, we can say public static void. This will be a void method that does not return anything. I'll just call it ugly, okay, because it's going to look pretty ugly, and this is how it's going to look like. I just say that from this method, all I want to do is throw, which means just throw an exception, and exception is an object, so I need to create it as new, and this will be, if I spelled everything correctly, the type of exception that I want to throw from here. Okay, so I'll just say, okay, let's throw an exception. As soon as we call this method, it'll generate runtime exception. Let's take a look. I just go to the top of my main method and say example of unchecked exception, which I know will be definitely happening. So here I'll just call ugly. Okay, just say, okay, let's call this method and see what happens. So first, what I'd like to do is to go back to the name of my project, right click and say clean and build, just to verify that the build works okay. All right, so it tells me finish building, and you can see that the build was successful. Everything is fine. So now, of course, if I run this program, okay, because I'm going to be generating runtime exception pretty much immediately after entering the main method and calling ugly. Okay, so here we go. We get main, we get ugly, we generate the code, the Java language runtime exception. This is an example of Java unchecked exceptions. And there is an exception hierarchy in Java library, and all of these number format exception and input mismatch exception, and we also try this arithmetic exception. Okay, these are all called unchecked exceptions. Unchecked because they're unchecked at compile time. Compiler doesn't care. But there is a second type of exceptions in Java, which are called checked exceptions. Checked versus unchecked exceptions. So the second type of exception is actually exceptions of type exception. without runtime prefix. So I'll just change this, same code, right? We already know how it behaves. The throw statement generates an exception. And we say throw new Java language runtime exception, but this time we change it to an exception, which is this time a checked exception. Okay, so this is checked exceptions of type, and these are unchecked exceptions of this type. Okay, so with this only change from runtime to exception, which is checked exception. Well, checked exception like this means that compiler is going to realize that this method definitely throws an exception. This is how you throw an exception if you want to. And it just says, okay, this exception is of type unreported checked exception. All right, so this time if I try building this code, okay, just say clean and build, you see that the compiler is unhappy and it says unreported exception, named exception, must be caught or declared to be thrown. So this brings us to the rule for the catch or specify requirement for checked exceptions. All right, so let's go here. So what can I do with this rather meaningless manipulation of statements? But I tried to keep this demo to as small as possible. You see that my error is on this line. The compiler is unhappy with this throw, and it says, well, you can't just really kind of like throw it like this because this is checked exception. You're asking me to verify that this method never throws any exceptions, and yet you're doing this. Okay, so then we have to specify it by saying throws. Throws this type of exception. This version suggests that this method ugly can throw an exception, and in this case we're expecting that the caller, such as main method or some other method, should deal with this exception by potentially using try and catch. So now let's build again. We right click and we say clean and build. And look, this time the error is here because now the compiler says this method ugly has a potential to throw an exception. You can no longer call this method because it specifies that it can throw an exception. Now what you must do, you have to use try and catch. I am not going to compile this code just as written. Now I will require that you catch it. Okay, so now we will say try, right? It's kind of silly because it's not very meaningful to have a method that all it does is just throw some sort of an exception, but it's just to demonstrate Java rules. So we now call ugly inside the try, and of course try requires that we have a catch, and this catch of course will be catching this. Okay, and that's the requirement, and I typically call my exceptions EX right here, and we say that I guess we can just report something to display on the screen and say that a Java link exception caught. Okay, so something like this. So this time if I save everything and build my code one more time. So this time it's fine. So you see that build was successful. Everything worked just fine. So what does it tell us? Let's bring this back to the same tab group and resize it. And I'd like to show you that this catch or specify requirement is related only to checked exceptions, checked the meaning of checked is checked at compile time. So the compiler is trying to deliberately prevent this program to have a path to crash at runtime by saying you're using exceptions. They're kind of dangerous because if you don't handle them, the program will crash. However, I have a set of rules such as catch or specify, and if you follow these rules, you can write the code which will guarantee that there will be no crash at runtime. So specify is this. Okay, so you write some code, you detect your own error, and you say, okay, let's throw an exception. If you're using runtime exceptions, you don't have to remember any of this. But if your choice is to use checked exceptions, which are of this type, Java language exception, then you have to catch it right here in this method, which is kind of meaningless because your idea is to report an error from this method to the outsider, to the caller. So then the requirement is that you specify that this method throws an exception by doing this. Okay, so it's just kind of like, if you want to do this, you have to do this. And that's that you specify that this method throws an exception. And the second method or requirement that you have to have is that if you are not going to say throws this exception, then you have to use try and catch. So you know for sure that ugly can throw an exception object. So you have to wrap ugly inside try and catch, and then you just say, okay, Java exception was caught. Of course, this will be printed because, of course, it'll work like this. So if we run this to verify, you see that the first message that we're printing from this code is that Java language exception was caught. Okay, so this is the second version of the requirement, which is a catch. And finally, I think, let me try this, that if I temporarily get rid of my try and catch like this, and so we're stuck with this ugly. If we try building it, right, it tells me unreported exception, which means you have to catch or specify it. So let me try to specify it right here. Can I say that my main method throws this exception? Let's find out how this is going to behave. So we're going to say clean and build. Okay, so this time it builds fine, it has no problem. And if I try running it, we're generating exception and we're crashing our program, but we told the compiler that even in our main method we're going to ignore this, and this default behavior of Java virtual machine, which will realize that the exception is thrown and it's okay to shut down this program, safely remove it from computer memory, and let it generate this ugly message. Okay, so to be able to achieve this kind of ugly result, we had to specify 2 times, right? So we used the specify idea 2 times. First, we said that, okay, we have a method in our system that can throw checked exception. And then we said, okay, we're going to start calling this method. And of course, without any effort, compiler will stop us from doing this, but we specified the second time and we say, no, it's okay. We expect this to be fine. All right. So you really can decide if the checked exceptions are good for you, and this is what you'd like to do, with a compiler interfering with your attempts to not to follow catch or specify requirement, then you can rely on this. If you want to simplify your life a little bit and forget about all of these catch or specify requirements, you can just rely on the runtime exception types. So runtime exception types, a compiler will ignore. It can still see this throw statement and everything, but by default it knows, oh, that's an unchecked exception. I really don't have to worry about this. Okay, so these are the rules that are kind of like specific to checked exceptions, and that's catch or specify requirement. And this is the summary of this, and this is the demonstration. So if you're a little bit confused about this demonstration, don't worry about it at all. But sometimes when you work with existing code and you start getting certain error messages, and it's something to do with exceptions, and it's something that's reported as unchecked exception, or checked exception is not being called or specified, then you need to remember that this requirement exists, and this is forcing you to follow these types of rules.